the gardens.
We're going to talk about growing things like hops. So, Matt, you have a beer.
Yes, I do have a beer.
And I have a beer. These are beers that we make here at Public House, like the Elusive IPA and the Dry Fly IPA. We are drinking these beers because these are beers that we highlight one of the ingredients that we make beer with, a little bit more heavy-handed, and that is the hop. What is a hop, Matt?
It grows on a vine. It's a vinous plant. Most of the hops grown in the United States are grown out in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. There's a few other places throughout the country that are starting to grow some more hops. Michigan, New York. Some hops are starting to pop up. Some local trials are coming up here in Missouri. But they grow on very tall vines, and the hop itself is the flower of the plant. And it's almost what some people call a cone, a hop cone or a hop flower because of the shape. And inside that little flower, that hop cone, is all this little tiny yellow residue called lupulin. And that lupulin is really what drives the bitterness. And there's also a bunch of oils in there in the hop cone itself too that helps drive some aroma and flavor. So yeah, it's a plant, man. Several different places throughout the brewing process you can add hops, but what we do here generally is we're going to add hops in the kettle during the boil. And if we add hops early in the boil, that's going to drive a lot more of the bitterness to the beer. If we add hops kind of in the middle of our boil, that's going to drive a lot more kind of what I call flavor hops. It starts to drive some more flavor and some aroma. And then late in the boil, at the very end, that's the hops you add to get all that nice aroma. So when you bring that glass to your nose and you start to smell some of that aroma that you're picking up, that's coming from those late addition hops. We also will add hops into our whirlpool. Same thing, driving a lot more of that aroma character. So typically they're being added into kettle additions. But however, these two beers that we're drinking today also utilize a dry hop, what we call dry hopping. And that is after the beer is finished towards the end of fermentation, we add more hops into the fermenter. And what that does is it gives this unique, what we call a dry hop flavor character to the beer. That's where we typically add all our hops here at Public House. There are a few other places people are experimenting with hops, first kettle additions, hops in the mash. Lots of crazy stuff out there, but
hops in everything.
Hops in everything.
All the time.
Anywhere and everywhere.
There's two things that I find pretty interesting about hops. One is that, as Matt alluded to, when we cook them, the longer we cook them, the more bitter they become. You know, bitterness is something that is usually an indicator of things to not eat, and so most people just by kind of
bitter's bad,
and it's kind of just built into our DNA that bitter's bad, but somehow IPA has been, this bitter beer.
You see that a lot with people that drink IPA for the first time that have never had an IPA. They instantly react with, oh wow, that's bitter. But then you have somebody that drinks IPA regularly, or a beer with lots of hops. They tend to, some of the bigger IPA beers we put out, they don't phase them whatsoever, So as your palate develops, you pick up an appreciation for that level of bitterness.
I think that leads me into the second thing I find interesting about hops. If you were to go to like a hop farm and you would look at these plants, these are very very large, but they all look very similar, right?
Yeah.
Like the hop. If you look at hops and kind of to a layman, they would all look very similar. And there's hundreds of varieties of hops grown around the world. And what I find interesting is that, just like I guess anything else that you grow, they have very unique flavor and aroma profiles. And depending upon even where you grow, you can take the same hop and grow it in the upper Midwest, and you could grow it in maybe 4 or 5 different farms out in the Northwest, and you could have a lot of different flavor profiles. So it's very similar to grape growing. It's very specific to that year, what happened that year.
It picks up the terroir from the land. It really does.
Yeah, and and we have to be careful of that because we're constantly. I think that it's one of those things that, because of that, and the flavor profiles are so different, you can actually coax a lot of flavors. Like I think that obviously we're using different hops in this beer than we are in that one, and while there's some similar traits and attributes, they're very, very different, and the hop flavor is very, very different, and the bitterness is very different, and the aroma is very different, and it's kind of just interesting that from something that looks seemingly the same and identical, there's a lot of palette. There's a lot to the palette there, right? There's a lot of colors you can paint with, and I find that to be pretty fun and unique, but also difficult because it changes, and so we're constantly tweaking recipes with lot, right?
Yeah,
with different lots of
different lots,
crop that
different
come
crop
in.
years, year to year, and throughout the year, even as those different lots come in the brew house, we have to make slight adjustments so that way we keep the consistency from batch to batch.
Third thing I find interesting about hops.
There's a third thing.
There's a third
He only promised us two.
Bonus is really that they're pretty volatile as an ingredient, and I think that's why you hear people talk about drinking IPAs fresh, and there's a lot of people that go to some pretty extreme measures to make sure that people drink them fresh. The flavor profile in IPAs, I think, is one that changes the most over time. So and we know this, the beer that we're making as we're making it in the back, and the day that we're putting it in the keg and the day that we're putting it in the package is so bright and so, kind of true, right? To what we're going after, but because of it, because it's an ingredient that we're cooking in, and a lot of the flavor profiles coming from the aromatics, those are pretty volatile, and they change and they fall out.
Yeah.
And so the beer changes, and over time, and so it's kind of interesting to see that IPA. It's a pretty hard to be consistent, I feel, with IPAs, which is another reason why I find it interesting that it's so popular.
Yeah, right.
Because it is very inconsistent from not necessarily batch to batch, but it changes probably more than any other beer style from the time you make it as it ages.
Because they're always best to drink them fresh, but I think a well-made IPA that can stand up on a shelf for a few months, that really makes, or can really showcase a good IPA is, if you pick it up off the shelf and it still tastes good to you after 3 months, 4 months, then that's a well-made IPA in my mind.
I think so too. I think that's what we really strive to do here, and it's hard to not.
Yeah, because the market right now
full.
so wants very aromatic forward IPAs right now, and these very cloudy New England style IPAs where a lot of those hops are added very late in the boil, or even just pounded dry hops. Well, like Josh was saying earlier, those hops are very volatile, and those will kind of dissipate from the flavor of the beer very quickly as it sits on the shelf or sits in a keg. And so to keep the flavor that the brewer intended on those styles of beers is they don't last very long, so it's very hard to do. And making a beer like that stand up on a shelf for a long time, or a few months or whatnot, that'd be hard to do.